The crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his subsequent resurrection formed the very heart of Christianity. And, for example, Jesus did not come to the earth simply to teach people how to live. His primary mission was to live the life we should have lived, which qualified him to step into our shoes and on the cross die for us, pay the price for our sin that otherwise we would have to pay but never could. When he rose from the dead 3 days later, that validated who he was, because Jesus had predicted both his crucifixion and his resurrection, and showed that God accepted his sacrifice on our behalf. So in this lecture, I want to take a look at the biblical and historical evidence why we know Jesus, in fact, died on the cross. Now, Muslims, generally speaking, most Muslims deny that Jesus was crucified, and certainly that he was crucified on our behalf. But a wealth of evidence from the Bible and simple logic and history indicates beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus, in fact, was crucified. For example, his crucifixion was not done in a corner in the dark of night. It was done in front of multiple witnesses, both his friends and his foes. And the Jewish leaders were there. Of course, the Romans were present. His mother and other relatives were present, as well as the disciples, and just a host of other people. So there were people who knew that it was Jesus, and of course, for his enemies, the Jewish leaders and the Romans, they made sure that it was Jesus because they wanted him dead. So there is no doubt about that. This is, furthermore, if you look at, for example, in Mark chapter 15, as Jesus was being led to be crucified, it says, they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross, because he was so weakened by the beating that he had endured that he couldn't carry the cross all the way to the mountain where he was being crucified. Now, that the only reason for putting those names in, particularly Alexander and Rufus, is that they were known people. And so what the writer is saying is, if you have any doubts about this, go ask them. And so the crucifixion is referred to in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, the epistles of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Hebrews, and 1st and 2nd Peter, as well as 1st John and Revelation. They all record the death of Jesus, and when the manner of that death is mentioned, they all state it was by crucifixion. And again, remember that the epistles began being written within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, and the Gospels, there is good evidence that the entire New Testament was completed by AD 70, or at the very latest, by about 95 AD. So these accounts were written at a time when there were witnesses still alive who could attest to the facts. But as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the crucifixion was even referred to in the early Christian creed. I mentioned two Christian creeds in 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians chapter 2. Both of those creeds, and those creeds go back to just shortly after the crucifixion in the early 30s AD. They both refer to Jesus' death. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4, it says, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried. And in Philippians, it says, it refers to the manner of his death, even death on a cross. And so both of those creeds are early and pre-Pauline. In other words, they appear in two books written by the Apostle Paul. Paul was simply incorporating these creeds that already existed. And virtually all scholars across the theological spectrum recognize that these are two pre-Pauline creeds, and therefore they are, just within a few years preserving the fact of the crucifixion. Then there's medical evidence of his death. There was a detailed article in the Journal of the American Medical Association a number of years ago that discussed the events leading up to the crucifixion, his being flogged and so on, and then the crucifixion itself. As the author of that medical article says, that any interpretation based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appears to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So, but then we have the records in the Gospels of the fact that he was buried in a tomb. Now, you may recall that the Roman prefect who authorized the crucifixion was Pontius Pilate. After the crucifixion, the Bible records that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, requested Jesus' body in order to bury it. Pilate released the body to Joseph, but only after first confirming from the centurion in charge of the crucifixion that Jesus, in fact, had died. And as I say, then the creed from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, ends with the statement that he was buried. Jesus was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's own tomb, and therefore it was a known location. The Bible also says that a large stone was rolled to close the entrance, and then the tomb was sealed by the Roman government, and a guard was placed to guard the body so that nobody took it, and so on. The acts of the Roman government and Pontius Pilate himself indicate that Jesus Christ had died. And we know that, of course, from the accounts that of the crucifixion, that the two men crucified on either side of Jesus, their legs were broken by the Roman soldiers. And the reason they did that is that when one was being crucified, one tries to lift oneself up by, using your heels to fill your lungs with air, but then you sink down. You go up and down. The legs of the two were broken so that they couldn't do that, so that they would die quickly. But the Romans noticed that Jesus had already died, but to confirm that, the Roman took his spear and pierced Jesus' side, and which evidently, according to the medical journal article, punctured his pericardium around the heart, and out came blood and, as the Bible says, water, or probably pericardial fluid, so indicating that he was in fact dead. The Bible also records the reaction of the disciples, and their immediate post-crucifixion reaction is consistent only with Jesus' death by crucifixion, because recall in John chapter 20, it says that the disciples were in a room and the doors were shut for fear of the Jews. Now, that's only explicable if their leader, Jesus, had been killed, and they're afraid now that the Jewish leaders are going to come after them. Mark 16 records that the disciples were mourning and weeping, and two other disciples, one of whom was named Cleopas. In Luke 24, it says that he was on the road to Emmaus, and he and another disciple, they were looking sad because of what had happened. And they spoke, too, of how the chief priests and our rulers delivered Jesus to the sentence of death and crucified him. So we have a number of people, and the reaction, they're sad. They're mourning and weeping because Jesus had been killed. There's no other explanation for their mourning and weeping and sadness unless if Jesus had not been killed. The Bible also contains what's known as self-damaging material. In other words, material that if the Bible had been written, if the New Testament had been written 100 or more years after this, they never would have put in that Jesus is crucified, because other would-be messiahs and leaders had also been crucified, but they didn't rise from the dead. But of course, their movement of these others then fell apart. And so if you want to show anyone that somebody is not a Messiah, you'd have him crucified by the Romans, which is exactly what happened to Jesus. The point being that that's an indication that the Bible was not made up long after the fact, because they never would have said that, but it was true. So these are true accounts. And if the Bible was written long after the fact, they wouldn't have shown the disciples to be so fearful and so on, because that makes them look bad. That's the kind of self-damaging material that historians look to, one of the things, to determine whether whether or not it's a true account. Also, there is confirmation of his death by crucifixion by hostile and non-Christian sources. Celsus was a 2nd century Roman and a virulent critic of Christianity. Well, he affirmed that Jesus was crucified and died on the cross. There's actually a picture representing the crucifixion. It was found scratched into the plaster of a wall in a building called the Pedagogium on Palatine Hill. And the drawing shows Jesus on the cross, but with the head of a donkey, while a man standing on the ground is looking up to the crucifixion. And the description reads, Alex Amenos worships his God. And that is very, very early, that picture. Also, the crucifixion is confirmed by the Babylonian Talmud, which is the central text of rabbinic Judaism. And it's affirmed also by a later Jewish anti-Christian document called Toledat Yeshu. The crucifixion is confirmed by the 1st century historian Josephus, by the Roman historian Tacitus, who lived from about 55 AD to 120, by Lucian of Samosata, who was a Greek anti-Christian satirist, and by Mara bar Serapion. He was a Stoic philosopher from Syria, and he wrote between about AD 70 and 200, wrote a letter to his son to motivate him to emulate wise teachers of the past, and he refers to the murder by the Jews of Jesus. And so, essentially, all of these works established that no one in the ancient world doubted that Jesus had died by crucifixion. It had, in fact, become common knowledge. Finally, there are no plausible or credible alternative explanations. Many Muslims, for example, believe that somebody else was substituted for Jesus. And so it was not Jesus who was crucified. But again, they don't really know who. Some people say Judas Iscariot was crucified. Someone say one of the guards was crucified in his place. But again, Jesus was present before the Jewish Sanhedrin and then the Romans from the time of his arrest up until his crucifixion. He was never out of their presence. And again, the Jewish leaders had every motive to make sure that it was Jesus. Yahya Emmerich is a Western Muslim. In his book on understanding Islam, he said that the Romans grabbed the wrong man, thinking that all Semites looked alike. But all Semites do not look alike to other Semites. And again, Jesus' own mother was there. A mother knows who her son was. So, there's simply no credible evidence that anyone other than Jesus was crucified. There's no credible evidence that anyone other than Jesus was crucified in Jesus' place. The other main alternative is what's called the swoon theory. This was primarily a 19th century attempt to say that, well, Jesus only fainted or swooned on the cross, but then when he was put into the tomb, he revived. But again, there is really no basis for that at all, because the uniform testimony of all the early witnesses was, both his friends and Jesus' foes, was that Jesus had died by crucifixion. Also, the swoon theory is contrary to the physical evidence, because crucifixion, you basically die largely by asphyxiation. I indicated trying to get the breath. And as one author puts it, that the crucifixion is essentially death by asphyxiation. As the intercostals and pectoral muscles around the lungs halt normal breathing while the body hangs in the down position. Therefore, faking death on the cross would not permit one to breathe. One cannot fake the inability to breathe for any length of time. Also, the swoon theory does not take into account the spear thrust into Jesus' side. And as that American Medical Association journal article pointed out, that the spear probably perforated not only his right lung, but also the pericardium and the heart, thereby ensuring death. And remember also that Pilate asked the centurion to confirm whether or not Jesus was dead. That centurion had to be absolutely sure that he was dead, because otherwise he would be lying to the governor and his own life would have been at stake. Also, think about it, when Jesus' body was taken by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus to the tomb, he never would have been buried had there been, and prepared for burial, had there been even one spark of life left in him. And of course, remember that a heavy stone, I've read that the stone probably weighed around 2,000 pounds. How could Jesus have moved that stone? He had been beaten, crucified, and so on and so forth. He absolutely could not do that. Finally, if he did come out, if he had swooned and so on and so forth, and then was able to move the stone, get out of the tomb, escape the guard that had been posted, he would have shown up to his disciples, looking like this, help, help. They never would have said that he has risen from the dead, that he has overcome death itself. It's just, there is no plausible explanation for Jesus, what happened to Jesus, other than that he died by crucifixion. And in fact, even highly critical scholars say that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, since both Josephus and Tacitus agree with the Christian accounts on at least that basic fact. Consequently, another author concludes, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is a fact which no one can doubt unless he willfully ignores all biblical and non-biblical accounts that have come to us. So I think that is absolutely clear. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the crucial fact, namely of Jesus' resurrection.